Well, thank you, worship team. That was amazing. Welcome here this morning, and welcome to those of you who are joining us online. I'm excited for this morning. I want to start off by telling you about my first and last lemonade stand. I was probably about 8 years old. We were living in Regina at the time. Not that that matters, but my parents were having a garage sale. And I thought, I want to be like the kids on TV, and I want to have a lemonade stand. And so they're having the garage sale, and I make my lemonade, and I kind of, park it on the driveway close to where the action is. And I can't remember if I sold it for 10 cents a cup or 25 cents a cup, but I learned from Ken this morning that kids are now selling it for $1 a cup. So that's expensive. So I had my lemonade and I started selling it. But the problem was I didn't know that I needed to make change. And so people would come up and they would give me $2 bills, because those existed back then, or $5 bills. I remember one lady gave me a $10 bill, and I was like, thank you so much. And and I'm not giving you instructions, kids, okay? This isn't how you should run your lemonade stands, but I got away with it for a while, actually. And but I wasn't doing it on purpose. I just didn't know I needed to provide change. And then I think it was the $10 bill lady went and found my mom and brought her over and was like, your daughter isn't giving change. And I felt so embarrassed. I felt so mortified. That's probably why that was my last lemonade stand. I'm really not good at math. Even when I was a server as an adult and I had to make change at the table back when people paid with cash more often, I would actually leave the table to go make the change because I was too embarrassed to make it in front of people because I very rarely made it right, unless it was like $10 minus $2. Like I could do that. It's 8. But thankfully, I have a husband who is amazing at math and also incredibly kind to never make me feel dumb about any math-related questions I ask. And trust me, they are basics sometimes. But yeah, that was my first and my last lemonade stand. And I was a corrupt lemonade vendor at that point. But I didn't do it on purpose. But in a minute, we're going to talk about some people who were corrupt and they were doing it on purpose. And so we're going to start off this morning by looking at a diagram of the temple. I even have this laser pointer that I got specially for this. And I love this thing so much. I might, like, during Pastor Ken's sermons, just sit in my seat and help you follow along in the scripture readings like this. So if you see that, you know what's going on. The laser pointer, I'm too attached to it. But for us here today in our 2024 Christian society, specifically as evangelicals, the idea of temple restrictions, as they applied to nationality and gender in Jesus' day, those are pretty foreign to us. Because for the most part, you all can go anywhere in this building you'd like, right? We are careful with our 4 kids and our nursery. We only let our screened workers down there. Even as parents, when you drop off, you're not allowed to go in. So we do that for safety's sake and to follow our insurance guidelines. But other than that, this building's kind of a free-for-all, isn't it? Like, I've found people just randomly in my office before. So it's like you can go wherever you want. And, we have a sanctuary where we worship and we read scriptures, but where we also will take all the chairs down and have a Christmas carnival in it. Or we have a boardroom where prayer happens and then business happens, right? We have these multi-purpose spaces, and we are so focused on the fact that the church isn't this building, right? Fort Saskatchewan Alliance Church isn't this pile of wood and bricks. It is the people here in this room, and the Holy Spirit is within us, and so wherever we go, we are the church. That's our focus. And so it's a little strange for us to understand the temple, but the temple in Jesus' day was a very structured place. And in order for us to set the table to talk about table number 3 today, and I know Pastor Ken said that last week, I ripped it off from him, we're going to look at the temple in a little bit more depth. So here comes my laser pointer. So this is the temple kind of complex, okay? And so the temple was holy. This entire thing was considered holy, but it increased in holiness from the outside until you went inside, where it got just the most holy. And so Starting out here, we have what was called the Gentiles' courtyard, and we're going to be talking about that more in a minute. And then if you go through right here, labeled as number 9, you have the women's courtyard. And now this wasn't just a courtyard where only women could be. This just meant that this was the furthest that women could go into the temple at this time. And so men would be in there as well, and this is where the treasuries were. And so the widow giving her mite, this would have happened in the women's courtyard. And then, it's kind of hard to see here, but there's a more narrow sort of courtyard here, and that's the Israelites' courtyard. But more specifically, it was the Israelite male courtyard, so only Israelite men could go in there. And then in here, you have the priest's courtyard, and only priests could go in there. And then you go into this temple proper, and you have the holy place, and then you have the Holy of Holies. You have the holiest place. And a specially selected priest could go in there only once a year on the Day of Atonement. So right here, you have the altar, and a big part of temple worship at this time was bringing sacrifices for sins, but also for other things as well, sacrifices and offerings. And so you can see the altar was right here. So the men in the Israelites' courtyard, they could see their sacrifices being made, and the women in the women's courtyard, they could see their sacrifices being made, not as clearly, but they could, kind of like see through. But where we're going to land today and where our story takes place is out here in the courtyard of the Gentiles. And so this is where we find table. I need to make sure this is off because I was almost blinding the sound people back there this morning. This is where we find table number 3 in our series. So we're going to take some time and we're going to learn about this courtyard, why it was there in the first place, what happened there. But before we do that, we're going to read our passages for today. And so if you want to grab your Bible, if you have one, whether a hard copy or on your phone, there is Bible in the chair bottom in front of you. If you don't have a copy of the scriptures, we would love to gift you one so you can find myself or any of the pastors or anybody wearing a lanyard name tag, and they will know where to find you a Bible. So we're going to turn to John chapter 2 and read verse 13 to 17. It's also up there on the screen for you. All right. It was nearly time for the Jewish Passover celebration. So Jesus went to Jerusalem. In the temple area, he saw merchants selling cattle, sheep, and doves for sacrifices. He also saw dealers at tables exchanging foreign money. Jesus made a whip from some ropes. I love that. I don't think he just miracled the whip. I think he made it. He intentionally gathered these ropes and made this whip. That's so intentional. That's so premeditated. He made a whip from some ropes and chased them all out of the temple. He drove out the sheep and cattle, scattered the money changers, coins all over the floor, and turned over the tables. Then going over to the people who sold doves, he told them, "Get these things out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a marketplace." All right, so that's reading number 1. And then we're going to go read from Mark 11. So you want to go back in your Bible. Mark comes before John. Mark chapter 11, verses 15 to 17. Give you a second to get there. So it says, when they arrived back in Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple and began to drive out the people buying and selling animals for sacrifices. He knocked over the tables of the money changers and the chairs of those selling doves, and he stopped everyone from using the temple as a marketplace. He said to them, "The scriptures declare, 'My temple will be called a house of prayer for all nations,' but you have turned it into a den of thieves." So if we can just get that meme up there, Caleb. My husband really enjoys this one. If anyone ever asks you what would Jesus do, remind them that flipping over tables and chasing people with a whip is within the realm of possibilities. And I think sometimes he uses that a little bit. He's like, well, and I'm like, but our anger has to be as righteous as Jesus is. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a moment, but feel free to use that one yourself. So I didn't read these two accounts this morning just for the sake of redundancy. It actually seems that Jesus cleansed the temple on two separate occasions. And so we have in 3 of the Gospels, we have Jesus cleansing the temple near the end of his ministry, just a few days before his crucifixion. And then in the Gospel of John, which we read first here, it actually has Jesus cleansing the temple near the start of his ministry, a few years before his crucifixion. So don't get stressed out by this. This isn't a discrepancy. We have 4 Gospels, so 4 books that tell about the life of Jesus. And they're called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You find them at the beginning of the New Testament. And 3 of those, Matthew, Mark, Luke, are considered synoptic Gospels. And what that means is that those 3 books include many of the same stories, and they include them in the same sequence as each other, whereas the book of John, the Gospel of John, focuses on different stories about Jesus and also on different themes about Jesus. It's really quite unique as far as the Gospels go. But again, don't let this stress you out. Because, say for instance, I invited 3 of you to come with me to an event this evening. Or you know what, actually let's use the vote. We have the vote this evening coming up. So say 4 of us at the vote, including me, we were asked to write a story about what happened at the vote. We all might include different things as the most important. Like maybe something will stick out to Jason that was the most important that would be different than what I see as the most important. And maybe same with Lori. And so that's what's going on here in the Gospels. You have these human writers that are observing what's going on, and different parts of the story are hitting them as the key things that they want to talk about. And that's different because of the different audiences that they're writing to as well. So don't be stressed about that fact. But that's kind of what's going on there. And so we see, I believe, that Jesus cleansed the temple at the beginning of his ministry and that he cleansed it again near the end. And I actually read some really interesting articles this week about the role of this kind of being a throwback to the Levitical priests in the Old Testament. So in the scriptures, we read that Jesus is our high priest. And there were instructions for cleansing buildings that the Levitical priests had that had to do with visiting, cleansing, waiting a period of time, checking back in to see if the disease had come back and if it had re-cleansing. And so it can be just a beautiful throwback to that as well. If you want that article, let me know. I'll send it to you, and it does a very intricate job at explaining that, much more so than I've done. But this morning, we're going to focus mostly on the second cleansing of Jesus, so the one that we would find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So as I mentioned, the passages that we just read, they both take place in the court of the Gentiles. And it's so important for us to understand what went on day to day in the court, and also why the court was there in the first place. So God-fearing Gentiles, so I think most of us here are Gentiles. We might have a Jewish person here. No, we're all Gentiles. Okay, so all of us, back in that day, if we worshiped God, if we had found the living God and we wanted to worship him, or if we had questions and we were interested, we would go to the temple and we would go to the court of the Gentiles. And so this is where you went to learn about God or also to worship. And a big part of worship was sacrifice. And so in the temple, if we just go back to that, diagram of the temple again, if you don't mind, Caleb. So in the temple, in the outer courtyard, you can see all of these pillars. So teachers would sit in between these, and so you could go and you could learn from someone. You could go learn about the scriptures, and then you would also bring your sacrifice, and you would hand it over to someone to take inside for you to be sacrificed on the altar. And the reason that the Gentiles had to pass their sacrifices on is because the courtyard of the Gentiles was actually as far as they were allowed in. So all of us would only have been allowed into this outer area. And this was taken very seriously. It's not like someone goes down to the Fort Kids area and we go, oh, you know what? Actually, only screen volunteers are allowed down here. Okay, thanks, bye. this is what the Jewish historian Josephus says. There were 13 stone slabs with writing in Greek and Latin that were placed at intervals on the barrier, so all around here, okay? And they were warning that the Gentiles were not to enter. So this is what Josephus says. There was a partition made of stone. Its construction was very elegant. So they spent money on letting the Gentiles know that they weren't welcome in. It stood upon the pillars at equal distances from one another, declaring the law of purity, some in Greek, some in Roman letters, saying that no foreigner should go within the sanctuary. Archaeologists have actually discovered 2 of these warning slabs, and this is what they say, okay? We have these in museums. They say no foreigner is allowed to enter within the balustrade surrounding the sanctuary and the court. Whoever is caught will be personally responsible for his ensuing death. So, we also know from Josephus that Roman law allowed the Jews, because remember, Jerusalem was an occupied territory at this time, right? The Romans are actually in charge. So Roman law actually allowed the Jews to execute any Gentile who entered the inner sanctuary. This is some serious segregation that we have going on. So we know what the court of the Gentiles is, but what went on in the court of the Gentiles? Well, from our passages, we read that there were people buying and selling sacrificial animals, right? And that there were individuals called money changers. So we're going to go through each of those. The money changers sat in the temple in the court of the Gentiles again to change foreign coins of pilgrims, so the people who came to Jerusalem to worship, they would change their foreign coins into Tyrian shekels, also known as the shekel of the sanctuary. So if you're going on a trip and you are going out of Canada, you usually will at least get some cash from the country that you're going to, right? So you go to, is it the bank where you go? I'm looking at Ken. Is it the bank? Why am I looking at Ken? I don't know. Yes, okay. So you go to the bank or wherever, and you get your money changed. And so maybe you take your Canadian dollars and you get them changed to American dollars, which is sad. Or you get them changed to pounds or euros, which is incredibly sad. Or maybe you change them to some other currency that's actually happy because our dollar's worth more. But you go and you do this so you can use the money that's appropriate in that place. And so the temple tax had to be paid in Tyrian shekels, and the reason was twofold. Other coinages had uneven value and weight, and the temple required this even value and weight. And also, all these other coins had idolatrous images on them. They had images of pagan gods or emperors that were being worshipped as gods, and these were not allowed in the temple. And so the money changers would take your money and give you the coins that you were allowed to use in the temple. So we also read about the selling of sacrificial animals and doves. Many people traveled a very long distance to worship and sacrifice in the temple, and they didn't have cars and they didn't have light rail transit. You know, they're traveling by caravan or walking or a donkey or, you know, maybe an old wagon. And so bringing along their own animal may have been difficult. So some people, actually many people, chose to purchase an animal for sacrifice once they got into Jerusalem. There were also other people in the temple, in the court of the Gentiles, and their job was actually a kind of quality control. And so the scriptures are very clear at the quality of animals that could be used as sacrifice, right? They had to be male, they had to be without spot, without blemish. And so these temple quality control people would check over your sacrifice to make sure that it was a suitable sacrifice, to make sure that it actually qualified. You wanted to make sure that you were offering a proper sacrifice to God. So you might be listening to this list and thinking, well, these things don't actually sound that bad, right? They all sound like things that are, you know, allowing people to worship and aiding and making sure worship is done properly and, you know, kind of conveniences so that people could have what they needed in order to worship. However, the issue with these things is the way they were practiced and where they were practiced. So we'll go through the list again. The money changers, they were able to decide their own exchange rate. So there was no standard exchange rate. They were just able to decide, you know what, I'm going to charge this person this much today. And they routinely gouged people who came in, specifically the foreigners, specifically the people from far away who didn't know as much what was going on. They would make enormous profits off of changing people's money. The people who were selling sacrificial animals, again, they were doing so at a very marked up and completely unfair price. They were gouging their customers. And then the quality control people, they were kind of in bed with the temple vendors. And so it was common for them to have an animal come through for inspection, and they would look at it, and it was fine, but they would actually say, oh, this doesn't actually meet our standards. This doesn't actually qualify. So you can't use this animal, and you have to go buy one marked up from the temple vendors. So such goings on exploited the poor and the foreigner, and it angered Jesus because it was strictly forbidden in the Mosaic Law, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. So even further, the money changing and animal selling, these services, they used to be provided outside of the temple area. So they were actually a little ways down the road, and so you would go there, you would change your money, you get your animals if you needed, and then you would come to the temple. But Caiaphas, the high priest, had authorized the sale of items necessary for temple sacrifice. He'd authorized that these could now be sold in the temple complex. And so the desire for convenience and maybe ill-gotten gain, it led to a safe haven for corruption in the very place that was supposed to be a sanctuary. The Gentile court was supposed to, as I've said, be a place of worship. But worship had become pretty impossible. I want you to imagine with me, never mind the corruption and the financial gouging that's happening, the court of the Gentiles has really been turned into a giant cattle auction / farmer's market. Right? So imagine we're in here right now, and there are animals over here for sale, and there's like birds squawking, and there's animal excrement everywhere, and there's people calling out, come get your money changed here. Would you have an easy time focusing on God? Would you have an easy time worshiping and praying? It was really, really hard for people to actually worship. And in addition, the outer court was actually where animals that were to be sacrificed, where they were kept, in addition to the animals that were for sale. So it was a zoo, actually. And then to make matters worse, kind of the cherry on top, is that this Gentile court, the high priest had allowed it to be used as a shortcut through from the Mount of Olives to the city itself. And so people were actually, who had nothing to do in the temple, they were actually just hauling their goods through this place. So you can imagine this is the only place that the Gentiles are allowed to worship. And it's a gong show, for lack of a fancier term. So when we read Jesus entered the temple and began to drive out the people buying and selling animals for sacrifices, when we read that he knocked over the tables of the money changers and the chairs of those selling doves, when we read that he stopped everyone from using the temple as a marketplace, that makes sense, doesn't it? Jesus isn't just on some huffy power trip here. I think that he's really motivated by how disgraceful it is that the temple has been allowed to become a common marketplace. But even further than that, I believe that the wrath of Jesus in this situation is motivated by his sense of justice that's being stirred up against the corruption present. But even further than that, I think that Jesus was angry on behalf of the marginalized, the have-nots, the outsider, and the foreigner, because they were being taken advantage of in the name of religion. So in verse 17, Jesus said, "The scriptures declare my temple will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have turned it into a den of thieves." And he's actually quoting Isaiah there, and we're going to read that again in a moment. We'll read that Isaiah passage. But Israel was called to be a blessing and a light to all of the world. We read in Genesis chapter 22, verse 18, where God is talking to Abraham, where he started this whole journey with Abraham's family, with the Israelites. And he tells Abraham, I'm going to make you abundant. I'm going to make your people plentiful. There will be more, you will have more offspring than the sand on the seashore or the stars in the sky. But he doesn't say, I'm just going to do this so you can be a boss and rule everybody. No, he says, all nations on earth will be blessed through your family. And what this means is that God decided to start a special relationship with Israel so that they could show people, and that through them he could show people what it looked like to worship the one true God, what it looked like to live in relationship with him, what it looked like to turn away from your own ways and to follow Yahweh. That was their job. Their job was to be a light. Their job was to be an example. They had the privilege of being God's chosen people for a purpose, for a reason. But instead, here they are profiting off of this very religion, this very faith that God instituted for them. And instead of being a light and welcoming the world in, they're just building constant barriers. And we find out they're spending a lot of money and time making them pretty as well. So I think that Jesus is angry that the temple has been turned into a marketplace. He's angry about the corruption, and he's angry because foreigners are being gouged. But I think ultimately, when Jesus comes and he flips over those tables, I think it's a condemnation of the very existence of a court of the Gentiles to begin with. Because this is what we read in the scriptures about how the Israelites are to deal with the outsider, with the foreigner. This is what it says in Numbers 15, verses 14 to 16. For the generations to come, whenever a foreigner or anyone else living among you presents a food offering as an aroma pleasing to the Lord, they must do exactly as you do. The community is to have the same rules for you and for the foreigner residing among you. This is a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. You and the foreigner shall be the same before the Lord. The same laws and regulations will apply both to you and to the foreigner residing among you. And the prophet Isaiah records the words of God regarding the Gentiles and the temple. And this is what Jesus was quoting. It says, foreigners who bind themselves to the Lord to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord, and to be his servants, all who keep the Sabbath without desecrating it, and who hold fast to my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain and give them joy in my house of prayer. Do you think the Gentiles had joy in the house of prayer with all the animal poop and the yelling and the vendors going back and forth? I don't think so. It says, their burnt offerings and sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. So if the scriptures instructed inclusion rather than segregation for the foreigners in worship, then why was Israel behaving this way? If they had scriptural evidence to include the Gentiles in, why were they continuing to segregate them out? Well, I have a couple of ideas. I think one part of it is they were concerned with keeping their power, their affluence, and their wealth, right? Think about how much money we read about, the booming business that the temple sacrifices and money changing were. And here's the thing, when you invite people in, when you just stop holding them in the outer courts and you invite them in, you actually give up your leverage to control them and thereby to profit off of them. So I think those are the explicitly evil reasons that Israel was doing this. But I think there's a more subtle reason as well, and I think it's one that we can all identify with. Because it can be tricky to sit at the table, whatever table it is, with people who aren't like you. When you are with people who share your beliefs and your lived experiences, when you're with people who have the same like political ideas or social ideas or, the same interest in music or movies, you can just be yourself, right? You can just kind of say what you want, do what you want, and it's pretty easy. You don't have to put an effort into remembering that your reality of the world and your lived experiences aren't everyone else's. You don't have to put an effort into ensuring that the way that you joke or the way that you reason or the examples that you use, you don't have to worry about if they're offensive to someone who isn't like you. It's human nature to flock to your own people. We see that. We see that in this church, right? Like when you hang out in a group, so our small group hung out, and the guys are in one area and the girls are in the other area, and that's not bad, right? Or you see, we make friends with people who have the same level of income as us, or the same, their kids are the same age, or maybe you don't have kids, so you want to find people who don't have kids, and that's all fine, right? It makes sense that we want to find people who are like us. But we can't take that in to our faith. We can't take that in to the working out of the church. We can't take that in to the spreading of the gospel. And I'll tell you why. It's because that's not how Jesus did it. Jesus was so intentional to include men and women from all nations. That's why he spent so much time teaching in the court of the Gentiles and in the court of women. It would have made sense for him just to go straight to the court of the Israelites to teach. And we read that he did that as well. But it would have made sense for him to go there, right? That's where all the Israelite men are. Back in those days, the men controlled society. They controlled their families. And so it would have made sense just to go there and tell them what was up, and then they could tell their families what was up. But that's not what Jesus wanted. That's not what Jesus did. He intentionally went where the foreigners were, where the Gentiles were. He intentionally went where the women were because he valued them, and he wanted everybody to have a place at the table. And friends, that is so instructive for us today. Unsurprisingly, Jesus was willing to overturn tables of injustice, tables of exclusion, even though it would have made him less popular, right, with the elites, with those in power. He wasn't concerned. He wasn't concerned about what the prominent thinkers of the day were thinking of him. He wasn't concerned what the Pharisees and the Sadducees were thinking about him. He wasn't concerned about what the people in power thought. He wasn't concerned what was, the right idea at the time, or the social order of the time, or the hierarchy of the time. He wasn't concerned. And he wasn't concerned about what was going to happen to him if he chose to welcome people in. So are we willing to do the same today? Where are we exclusionary? Where are we putting love for our own power or gain or just our own comfort in front of the mission of God? I want us to take a couple minutes now. Tiffany's just going to play for us, and we're going to ask Jesus that question. We're going to say, Jesus, where in my life am I preventing people from having a seat at the table because it's just easier for me not to? Or if I don't let them have a seat at the table, and these might be small, just like tables on a micro level, or they might be tables on a big, big level, whatever he's bringing to your mind. In the first service, he brought something to my mind when I was reflecting, and I went, yeah, it's just easier for me to just keep a certain type of people at this table with me, and it's just harder, it's just more work, I'm just afraid. So ask him. What does he have for you? What does he want for you? Where does he want you to step out of your comfort zone? Where does he want you to be brave? Where does he want you to not care what people think in order to show others his love? And you know what's amazing? Is that if Jesus hadn't welcomed us in, none of us would be here right now. None of us would have had access to his grace. And we're all in such desperate need of it. So let's take a couple moments. We're going to reflect together, and then we're going to sing. And we're going to sing asking the Lord to purify our hearts, to purify those false ideas, those desires for power, whatever it looks like. I think in this room, it's going to look so different for each of us. But Jesus wants to make us new. So let's pray, friends.